Everything your history teacher told you about fashion was a lie. Diamonds are not rare. Heels were invented for men, and the color pink was literally marketed as masculine until the 1940s. 60 of the biggest fashion myths that schools, brands, and history books have been feeding you for centuries are about to get completely destroyed in the most embarrassing way possible. And stick around because number 37 will make you question everything you thought you knew about beauty standards throughout human history. 1. Wearing white after Labor Day will get you socially canceled, and apparently this has been the law of the land forever. Except it was not. This rule was made up entirely by wealthy snobs in the 1800s who needed a way to spot new money families crashing their elite social circles. The average American never cared about this nonsense. RN fashion designers have been laughing at this rule and ignoring it for decades. You have been avoiding a color for a fake rule invented by rich gatekeepers. 2. Diamonds are rare, precious, and worth every penny you spent on that engagement ring. Except De Beers, the diamond company, literally built secret underground vaults and stuffed them full of millions of diamonds just to fake scarcity and keep prices sky high. The iconic phrase, "diamonds are forever," was not ancient wisdom passed down through generations. It was a 1947 advertising slogan written by a copywriter named Francis Garrity. You have been paying luxury prices for a rock that, geologically speaking, is actually pretty common on this planet. 3. High heels were made for women. And that is just a biological fact of fashion history, right? Wrong. And this one is genuinely embarrassing for everyone who believed it. Persian male soldiers invented heels in the 10th century specifically to lock their feet into stirrups while riding horses into battle. This was pure military engineering with zero fashion involved. Men wore heels proudly across Europe for centuries before women adopted them. The most masculine footwear in your closet has a warrior origin story that nobody talks about. 4. Corsets were basically medieval torture devices that evil men strapped onto helpless women against their will, at least according to every Hollywood movie ever made. The reality is that most women in the 1800s chose to wear corsets voluntarily and found them completely manageable in daily life. The extreme tight lacing shown in films was rare, dramatic, and mostly done for show. Why Victorian women ran entire households, worked farms, raised large families, and managed businesses while wearing corsets. The torture device narrative was largely invented by costume designers who needed a villain. 5. Blue is for boys and pink is for girls. And this has obviously always been the way things worked since the beginning of time. Except until the 1940s, it was completely flipped and nobody batted an eye. And pink was considered the stronger and more masculine color, while blue was seen as soft, delicate, and feminine. A 1918 American trade publication literally printed in plain text that pink was the appropriate color for boys. The gender color rules you were raised on are barely 80 years old and were driven entirely by post-war marketing departments. 6. Spending serious money on clothes means you automatically look better and more stylish than everyone else in the room. Our stylists who dress celebrities for red carpets and major appearances regularly pull $30 pieces from budget retailers and mix them into outfits nobody questions. Studies on how people perceive style consistently show that fit, grooming, and confidence rank far above price tag in making someone look well-dressed. The fashion industry has spent billions convincing you that quality lies in the price, but working stylists have known the truth for years. 7. Designer labels mean superior craftsmanship, better materials, and a product built to last a lifetime compared to anything affordable. Most major luxury fashion houses use the exact same overseas factories and the exact same fabric suppliers as the fast fashion brands, sitting 3 price tiers below them. The difference between a $400 shirt and a $40 shirt is often nothing more than a label sewn into the collar and a logo printed on the bag it comes in. You are paying roughly 90% for brand identity and about 10% for the actual physical product. 8. Ancient Egyptians invented eyeliner and kohl because they were obsessed with beauty, glamour, and looking incredible in the desert sun. They were not. Egyptian kohl was applied around the eyes as protection against the brutal desert sun and to physically repel flies and insects that carried disease. It was essentially military-grade eye armor that also happened to look dramatic. The beauty industry later repackaged this survival tool as cosmetic history and charged women premium prices for it. Cleopatra was not doing a makeup routine. She was doing battlefield prep. 9. Silk has always been the exclusive fabric of emperors, royalty, and the ultra-wealthy since the very beginning of its existence. In ancient China, silk was so widely produced and so common that peasants and farmers were literally paid their wages in bolts of silk fabric instead of coins. It was everyday currency, not luxury textile. Silk only transformed into a symbol of elite wealth after Western merchants got their hands on it and marked the price up by roughly 1,000% as it traveled along trade routes into European markets hungry for something exotic. 10. Cowboys wore 10-gallon hats because they needed to carry water across the desert, and that oversized brim served a very practical survival purpose. A 10-gallon hat physically holds less than 1 gallon of water, which makes the name almost aggressively misleading. The name actually comes from the Spanish word galón, meaning braid, referring to the decorative trim on the hat, and not liquid capacity at all. Real working cowboys wore these hats purely as sun shields against brutal heat. The rugged hydration myth is just another Hollywood invention dressed up as American frontier history. 11. Napoleon had a massive fashion complex and obsessed over his appearance because he was painfully short and desperately trying to compensate for his lack of height in every room he entered. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was completely average to slightly above average for a French man of his era. See, the short Napoleon story was British war propaganda deliberately spread to mock and undermine an enemy general during active military conflict. His supposed style insecurities were never documented anywhere. Britain basically invented a whole personality disorder for a man who was a perfectly normal height. 12. Fashion models are naturally and genetically built the way they look on runways and magazine covers, just blessed with extraordinary thin frames from birth. The extreme thinness that became normalized throughout 90s modeling culture was the direct result of industry mandates handed down by agencies and brands, not genetics or natural body diversity. Modeling agencies openly and formally pressured young women to maintain dangerously low body weights as standard operating procedure for staying employed. This was not a collection of individual choices. It was a systemic business policy that the industry built careers and entire aesthetic movements on top of. 13. Levi Strauss invented blue jeans from scratch and single-handedly built the most iconic piece of American clothing in history out of pure entrepreneurial genius. Levi Strauss was primarily a fabric and dry goods merchant who sold supplies to people. A tailor named Jacob Davis was the actual inventor who figured out that adding metal rivets to denim pants made them dramatically stronger and more durable for physical labor. Davis brought the idea to Strauss because he needed help financing the patent. Levi co-owned the paperwork. Jacob Davis invented the jean, and almost nobody knows his name. 14. The little black dress is one of Coco Chanel's greatest original contributions to fashion, and she essentially created it from nothing in a stroke of pure creative genius. Simple black dresses had been sitting in the wardrobes of working-class women across Europe for well over a century before Chanel published her famous 1926 design. Working women wore basic black because it was practical, affordable, and hid dirt from long shifts. What Chanel actually did was take a garment that poor women wore out of necessity and repackage it as something aspirational and desirable for wealthy women willing to pay for it. 15. Matching your socks perfectly to your outfit, or at minimum to each other, is one of the most basic and ancient rules of getting dressed like a civilized human being. See, mismatched socks were completely normal and unremarkable throughout most of recorded human history because nobody was mass-producing identical pairs in the first place. The cultural obsession with perfectly matching socks only became a thing after industrial manufacturing made identical pairs cheap and widely available in the 20th century. Before factories standardized sock production, wearing 2 different socks was just called getting dressed in the morning. 16. Ancient Romans walked around in flowing white togas, and that clean, bright image is basically the defining visual of an entire civilization that shaped the modern world. Roman togas were almost always dyed in rich colors and decorated with elaborate borders and patterns that signaled rank and social status to everyone in the room. Pure white togas were reserved for very specific political and ceremonial occasions, and were not everyday wear for ordinary Romans. Now, the all-white toga myth was born when European Renaissance scholars studied old marble statues that had lost their original paint over centuries and assumed the bare stone was the intended look. 17. Sunglasses were invented by some clever designer or celebrity culture moment as a stylish accessory to look cool while protecting your eyes from bright light. Now, sunglasses were invented by Inuit people thousands of years ago, and they were carved from bone or ivory with nothing but narrow slits cut into them to reduce glare from snow and ice. The entire purpose was preventing snow blindness in extreme Arctic conditions where reflected light could literally destroy your vision. Fashion had absolutely nothing to do with the invention. The coolest accessory in your drawer started as a survival tool built by people living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. 18. Underwear has always existed as the private foundational layer worn closest to the skin and protected from the outside world by outer garments worn on top. For most of human history, the layer worn directly against the skin was actually the only garment washed with any regularity, while outer clothing was rarely, if ever, cleaned between wearings. The inner layer absorbed sweat and body oils and got laundered while the expensive outer garments just kept getting worn. In practical terms, the outer clothes were the disposable layer and the undergarment was the one receiving all the actual maintenance and care. 19. Jewelry has historically been a feminine domain, and ancient women were the ones adorning themselves with rings and necklaces while men kept things simple and practical. Ancient Egyptian, Roman, Greek, and Viking men wore significantly more jewelry than women did and treated it as a serious public display of military achievement and social rank. Rings, heavy necklaces, arm cuffs, and decorative brooches were literally worn as war trophies after battle victories. A Viking warrior loaded with rings and chains was not being fashionable. He was walking around wearing a physical record of every enemy he had defeated. 20. Velvet has always been the exclusive fabric of kings and queens, reserved for royalty since the moment it was first woven into existence somewhere in the distant past. Medieval Italian street merchants were selling velvet openly on market corners to anyone with enough coins to buy it, and it was relatively accessible to ordinary people across European cities. Velvet only transformed into a symbol of royal exclusivity after European monarchies got so threatened by commoners wearing it that they literally passed formal laws making it illegal for anyone outside the nobility to put it on their body. The exclusivity was government-enforced, not natural. 21. The bikini was a revolutionary and scandalous invention that shocked the world when French designer Louis Réard unveiled it in post-war Paris and changed swimwear history forever. A two-piece swimwear existed in ancient Rome over 1,700 years before Réard held his press event. Archaeological mosaics discovered in Sicily dating back to around 300 AD clearly show women athletes competing and exercising in outfits nearly identical in design to the modern bikini. Louis Réard did not invent anything remotely new. He looked at ancient Roman athletic wear, gave it a catchy name after a nuclear test site, and took full credit for history. 22. Leather jackets have always been the uniform of rebels, bikers, and dangerous outsiders living life on the edge of polite society since the very beginning of their existence. The leather jacket was originally engineered for World War I military pilots who needed serious protection against freezing temperatures at high altitudes where cockpits offered no insulation whatsoever. Bikers adopted the jacket decades after the war ended, and the rebellious cultural image came entirely from Hollywood films casting actors in them as dangerous characters. The jacket that screams rebellion was designed by military engineers solving a temperature problem for government employees flying planes in freezing air. 23. Women's fashion throughout history has fundamentally been about attracting male attention and making women appear as appealing as possible to the men around them. For centuries, the most elaborate and expensive female fashions, including enormous powdered wigs, impossibly wide panniers, and towering architectural hats, were specifically designed to signal wealth and social dominance to other women in the room. And these garments made physical intimacy nearly impossible and were completely impractical for attracting romantic attention. Women were dressing in a complex visual language aimed entirely at other women to communicate status, power, and social position in hierarchies men were not even part of. 24. And the suit and tie combination is a timeless and essentially eternal symbol of professionalism that serious working people have always worn to signal competence and authority in business settings. The modern business suit only became the accepted standard of American professional dress after World War II, when returning veterans brought military-style discipline and uniformity into corporate culture. Though before that era, suits were considered casual leisure wear, associated with relaxed weekend activities. Working professionals in earlier decades wore entirely different garments depending on their trade and industry. The uniform of corporate America is barely 80 years old and started as weekend clothes. 25. The keeping your hat on indoors has always been considered universally rude across all cultures and genders, and removing it upon entering a building is a basic rule everyone has always followed. This rule applied exclusively to men, and originated specifically from military greeting culture where removing a hat was a formal gesture of acknowledgement and respect between soldiers. Women were never included in the rule at any point in its history, because their hats were structurally pinned deep into their hairstyles and could not be physically removed quickly without dismantling an entire hairdo. Half the population was always exempt from this supposedly universal rule of basic manners. 26. In wearing just a t-shirt in public has been a completely normal and acceptable thing for men to do basically forever, and nobody ever thought twice about it throughout American history. The t-shirt was standard issue military underwear, and wearing one alone on the street was considered the direct equivalent of walking around publicly in your undergarments. Now, it was not until the 1950s when actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean wore t-shirts on film screens across America that the garment slowly became acceptable as standalone outerwear. For most of its existence, the t-shirt was underwear, and the men wearing them outside were essentially walking around half-dressed by the standards of their time. 27. So ancient Greeks were famous for their sandals, and the image of a toga wearing sandal-footed philosopher strolling through Athens is one of the most iconic visuals associated with the entire civilization. Most ordinary ancient Greeks went completely barefoot the vast majority of the time because sandals were expensive items reserved for traveling longer distances or attending formal social occasions. The universally sandaled Greek citizen is a Hollywood costume department invention that film productions repeated so many times it became accepted as historical fact. The philosophers and citizens you picture in sandals were almost certainly barefoot when those famous conversations actually happened. 28. Fashion Week runway shows exist to present the upcoming season's collections to consumers and give regular shoppers a preview of what they will be able to buy in stores within the coming months. Fashion Week shows are almost entirely theatrical productions staged for journalists, photographers, and wholesale buyers, and the dramatic pieces walking the runway almost never make it into actual retail stores in any recognizable form. The entire spectacle is essentially performance art funded by perfume sales, handbag licensing deals, and celebrity endorsements. The clothes are props in a branding exercise, and the real product being sold is the feeling of luxury that justifies the price of everything else in the catalog. 29. So wearing horizontal stripes is one of the most well-established style mistakes a person can make, because the lines visually expand your body sideways and make you appear significantly wider than you actually are. A 2008 study conducted at the University of York scientifically tested this assumption and found the exact opposite result. Horizontal stripes consistently made test subjects appear taller and slimmer than the same subjects wearing solid colors under identical conditions. The research has been repeated, and the myth has been busted multiple times by actual scientists. An entire generation of women avoided half their wardrobe based on style advice that was factually wrong and has been proven wrong repeatedly. 30. White wedding dresses are a deeply traditional and ancient symbol of bridal purity that brides have worn across cultures for as long as marriage ceremonies have existed in human history. And white wedding dresses only became the Western standard after Queen Victoria chose to wear white at her 1840 wedding to Prince Albert as a deliberate fashion statement designed to show off expensive lace on her gown. Before Victoria made that choice, brides simply wore their best dress in whatever color they owned, and red was historically the most popular bridal color across multiple global cultures. One queen's personal style preference became a global tradition that billions of people now treat as timeless and sacred. Here are points 31 to 40. 31. Perfume was invented in France, and the French have been the undisputed masters and original creators of fragrance since the very beginning of the art form that the entire modern beauty industry is built upon. Perfume was invented in ancient Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago, and the world's first recorded chemist was a woman named Taputi, who was documented making and distilling fragrances in 1200 BC. France did not invent perfume. France invented marketing perfume and then spent several centuries aggressively convincing the rest of the world that sophistication and scent were the same thing as being French. Taputi did the actual chemistry thousands of years before Paris existed as a fashion capital. 32. People in the Middle Ages dressed in depressing shades of brown, gray, and muddy earth tones because they lacked the technology, resources, and cultural desire to produce anything remotely colorful in their clothing. Medieval clothing was explosively and deliberately colorful, with bright reds, vivid yellows, deep blues, and rich greens worn openly by people across multiple social classes throughout Europe. The drab gray myth was born entirely from two sources, which were faded surviving textile artifacts that lost their pigment over centuries, and black and white illustrations made by later historians who were working from those same degraded materials. Medieval people were not dressing like sad monks. They were dressing like people who genuinely loved color. 33. Light buttons were invented as a practical fastening solution to keep clothing closed and secure on the human body. And that functional purpose has been their entire reason for existing since the very beginning. The earliest buttons ever discovered come from the Indus Valley Civilization around 2000 BC, and archaeological analysis confirms they were purely ornamental decorative accessories with no fastening function whatsoever. They were sewn onto garments as jewelry and status symbols and sat there looking decorative for over 1,000 years before anyone connected the obvious idea of using them to actually close a piece of clothing. Humanity had buttons for 10 centuries before figuring out what buttons were obviously for. 34. The fashion industry, with its seasonal collections, trend cycles, and built-in product obsolescence, is a natural byproduct of modern consumer culture that developed organically as society became wealthier and more image-conscious over time. Fashion seasons with deliberately engineered trend cycles were a calculated and intentional business model invented in the 1800s, specifically designed to make last season's perfectly functional clothing feel emotionally worthless, so consumers would feel compelled to keep spending money. The feeling that your clothes are suddenly outdated was not a natural cultural evolution. It was an engineered psychological mechanism built by an industry that needed repeat customers and figured out how to manufacture desire on a seasonal schedule. 35. Flip-flops are a casual modern American invention associated with beach culture, backyard barbecues, and the relaxed, informal lifestyle that defines summer in the United States. Flip-flops are among the oldest footwear ever discovered on Earth, with examples found inside ancient Egyptian tombs, dating back approximately 6,000 years. They were not casual beach shoes for Egyptian society. They were formal footwear worn by nobility and depicted prominently in royal artwork as symbols of status and civilization. And the shoe that Americans wear to grab gas station snacks was once considered elegant enough to be buried with Egyptian royalty as an essential item for the afterlife. 36. Wristwatches have simply always been the standard way for everyone to tell time on the go, and there was never anything unusual or gendered about strapping a small clock to your wrist as a practical daily tool. Wristwatches were widely considered feminine jewelry for men throughout the early 1900s, and self-respecting men carried pocket watches because wearing a tiny clock on your wrist like a bracelet was seen as delicate and unmasculine. World War I soldiers needed to check the time while keeping both hands free during combat operations, and suddenly wristwatches became a battlefield necessity. It took a world war to make men comfortable enough to wear what women had been wearing on their wrists for years. 37. Beauty standards have consistently and universally favored thin body types across human history and cultures worldwide, because thinness has always been associated with health, discipline, and physical attractiveness in every society that ever existed. For the overwhelming majority of human history, larger body sizes represented the universal beauty ideal across virtually every culture on Earth, because they signaled genuine health, access to sufficient food, financial wealth, and the physical resilience needed to survive periods of famine and hardship. The thin ideal as a dominant beauty standard is an extremely recent and historically unusual development, driven almost entirely by 20th century Western media, fashion photography, and the diet industry's financial interests. 38. Pocket squares are a purely decorative accessory that exists solely to add a visual flourish to a jacket breast pocket and have never served any practical purpose beyond making an outfit look slightly more intentional and finished. Pocket squares began as completely functional handkerchiefs that men carried in their breast pockets for practical daily use and wiped their faces with regularly. So the fashion industry deliberately separated the functional handkerchief from the decorative display version in the 1920s as a calculated move to sell men two separate products for two separate pockets instead of one practical item that did both jobs. You now buy a decoration and a handkerchief separately because someone in the 20s realized they could double the sale. 39. Sports bras are an obvious and inevitable invention that the athletic industry naturally developed as soon as women began participating seriously in sports and physical activity at any meaningful competitive level. The first sports bra was invented in 1977 by two women named Lisa Lindahl and Polly Smith, who literally sewed two jock straps together to solve a problem no sporting goods company had bothered addressing. But before that invention, athletic institutions and medical authorities were actively telling women that vigorous physical exercise was potentially dangerous for the female body, which conveniently meant no company felt pressure to design supportive athletic wear for women. The product did not exist because the industry had decided women should not be running in the first place. 40. The zipper was such an obviously superior fastening technology that it immediately replaced buttons across all clothing categories the moment it was introduced to the garment industry, and consumers embraced it instantly. The zipper was invented in 1893 and spent the next several decades being dismissed as unreliable, aesthetically ugly, and mechanically inferior to the button, which had centuries of trusted history behind it. Buttons completely dominated clothing production until World War II, when metal rationing forced military uniform manufacturers to switch to zippers out of pure material necessity rather than preference. The moment zippers appeared on military clothing, they became associated with modernity and practicality. And the fashion industry suddenly decided they were sleek and desirable all along. 41. France has been the undisputed birthplace and eternal capital of high fashion since the very beginning of sophisticated European style, and no other country ever came close to challenging its dominance in setting trends for the continent. Italy completely dominated European fashion for over 200 years before France managed to take the crown away. Florence and Venice were the undisputed global fashion capitals throughout the Renaissance period, producing the finest silk fabrics, of the most sophisticated tailoring, and setting every major trend that royal courts across Europe desperately copied and followed. France did not inherit an empty throne. It aggressively took the fashion capital title from Italians who built the entire industry first. 42. Sneakers have always been casual, everyday shoes, and their association with relaxed, informal dressing is simply the natural and original purpose these shoes were designed and built to serve from the very beginning. The first sneakers were deliberately engineered as serious performance athletic footwear designed to improve speed and reduce injury during competitive sport and physical training. They only crossed over into casual streetwear when urban communities in American cities during the 1970s began wearing performance shoes as everyday cultural identity markers. Brands then studied that organic street culture, packaged it into marketing campaigns, and sold it back to suburban consumers at premium prices as lifestyle product rather than athletic equipment. 43. Ancient and prehistoric people had absolutely no interest in fashion or personal appearance because survival consumed every waking moment. And decorating yourself was an irrelevant luxury that only modern, comfortable societies could afford to care about. Archaeological evidence confirms that Homo sapiens living approximately 100,000 years ago were deliberately collecting decorative shells, piercing them, and wearing them as jewelry, while also mixing colored pigments specifically for body decoration and personal adornment. Humans have been fashion conscious for literally as long as the modern human brain has existed on this planet. The desire to decorate yourself is not a symptom of modern vanity. It is one of the oldest and most consistent human behaviors ever documented by science. 44. Clothing labels accurately and completely describe exactly what materials your garment is made from, because consumer protection regulations require full and honest disclosure of every fiber used in manufacturing the product you purchased. The Federal Trade Commission only legally requires fabric labels to list fibers that make up 5% or more of the total garment composition. Brands can legally pack cheap synthetic filler materials into garments and face zero disclosure obligation, as long as each individual filler stays beneath that threshold. The tag on your expensive shirt is telling you a partial and carefully edited version of what you are actually wearing and staying completely silent about the rest. 45. The trench coat is one of fashion history's most elegant and deliberate design achievements. Created by sophisticated designers who wanted to produce a refined and stylish outerwear piece that would become a timeless wardrobe staple for discerning consumers. The trench coat was designed specifically for British soldiers fighting in the waterlogged, muddy trenches of World War I as purely functional rain protection engineered to keep men alive and dry in miserable battlefield conditions. The fashion positioning came entirely after the war ended, when veterans wore their issued coats back home into civilian life and style. Conscious observers began copying the look. Burberry did not design elegance. They designed survival gear that accidentally became elegant. 46. Mixing different prints and patterns in a single outfit is one of the most reliable ways to commit a serious fashion mistake. And every legitimate style authority agrees that combining prints creates visual chaos that no one should attempt. This prohibition was invented by American department stores in the 1950s to simplify styling advice for mass-market shoppers who needed easy rules to follow while buying off-the-rack clothing. Pattern mixing has been a celebrated and sophisticated high-fashion technique practiced for centuries across Japanese textile traditions, Indian fabric culture, and African fashion heritage long before American retailers decided it was a crime. The rule was never about aesthetics. It was about making shopping simpler for department store customers. 47. Women have worn dresses and skirts as their natural and universal garment throughout all of human history. And the division between female skirts and male trousers is an ancient and fundamental distinction that has defined clothing across every culture that ever existed. For the overwhelming majority of human history, both men and women across virtually every civilization wore robes, tunics, and loosely draped garments with no rigid gender division in silhouette or construction whatsoever. The strict cultural separation of skirts, exclusively for women, and trousers, exclusively for men, only solidified in Western fashion during the 17th century. A clothing division that feels ancient and biological is actually a few hundred years old and almost entirely Western in origin. 48. Lace has always been considered an inherently feminine fabric, associated with delicacy, softness, and traditionally female aesthetics since it first appeared in European fashion and textile production centuries ago. Lace was originally and exclusively a male status symbol of extraordinary expense and social power throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, when noblemen across Europe competed intensely to wear the most elaborate and costly lace collars and cuffs they could acquire. Where King Louis XIV of France became so personally dependent on the French lace industry that he passed formal government regulations controlling lace imports to protect domestic production. The most powerful men in European history were wearing the fabric you now find on bridal veils and baby clothing. 49. Dry cleaning is a thorough and complete cleaning process that leaves your garments genuinely sanitized, bacteria-free, and fully refreshed in a way that regular home washing either cannot achieve or would damage the fabric trying to accomplish. Dry cleaning uses chemical solvents rather than water and is specifically effective at removing oil-based stains from fabric while doing essentially nothing to sanitize garments, eliminate bacteria colonies, or neutralize sweat odor embedded in fibers. The majority of dry clean-only labels are added by clothing brands primarily for legal liability protection, rather than because the fabric genuinely cannot survive a gentle home wash cycle. Your dry-cleaned jacket came back pressed and chemically treated, but not actually clean in any biological sense. 50. A tartan plaid is an ancient and sacred Scottish tradition, with each clan pattern carrying centuries of authentic cultural heritage passed down through generations of Highland families who wore their specific tartan as a genuine marker of ancestral identity. Tartan plaid as a formal system of clan identity was largely invented and commercially packaged during the visit of King George IV to Scotland in 1822. See an event organized and theatrically choreographed by novelist Sir Walter Scott, who needed the whole affair to look authentically ancient and dramatic. Most clan tartans that Scottish families treat as ancient heritage are less than 200 years old and were designed specifically for tourist appeal during a single royal visit that lasted a few weeks. 51. The fedora is one of the most iconic masculine hats in American-style history and has always been associated with tough guys, us detectives, and men who mean serious business. The fedora was named after an 1882 stage play whose female lead character wore the style as her signature look. It was immediately adopted as a feminist fashion symbol, and women wore it confidently for decades before men started putting it on their heads in the 1920s. The toughest hat in male fashion history was invented by and for women. 52. New shoes always need a breaking-in period, and every sensible person accepts that enduring initial discomfort is simply part of owning footwear until the material softens and molds itself to your specific foot shape over time. Properly fitted shoes should feel comfortable from the very first wearing, with no painful adjustment period required whatsoever. The breaking-in myth was created to normalize consistently poor shoe sizing and bad design standards across the footwear industry. If shoes cause pain, they do not fit correctly, and no amount of suffering through wear will fix a fundamentally wrong size on your foot. 53. Behind every legendary fashion house is a singular creative genius, working in inspired isolation, sketching revolutionary ideas alone, and single-handedly defining the visual language of an entire era through pure artistic vision. Most major fashion houses operate as large structured corporations with substantial design teams, professional trend forecasting agencies, and marketing committees that approve every creative decision before anything reaches a runway. The lone genius designer narrative is a carefully constructed public relations myth built specifically to justify luxury pricing and create the romantic mystique that makes consumers feel their purchase connects them to something rare and extraordinary, rather than a committee-approved product. 54. Ice swimwear has gradually become more revealing over time as society slowly relaxed its standards, but early swimwear was always at least somewhat form-fitting and designed with the basic understanding that people would be seen while wearing it near water. Early American swimwear from the 1800s covered the entire body from neck to ankle, and women at many public beaches were legally required to use wheeled changing huts that rolled directly into the water so they could enter the ocean completely unseen by anyone on shore. Showing an ankle in a swimsuit was considered genuinely scandalous behavior. Americans once built rolling privacy machines specifically to hide women getting wet. 55. Saw royal families throughout history chose purple as their official color because they personally loved it and decided it would become their symbolic shade the way any powerful institution simply picks a color and claims it. Purple was legally mandated for royalty because Tyrian purple dye cost more than gold by weight at its peak. Producing just 1 gram required thousands of murex sea snails to be harvested and processed in a famously awful-smelling operation. Our royals did not choose purple out of preference or symbolism. They wore it because it was simply the single most expensive thing a human being could put on their body. 56. Shoulder pads dominated 1980s fashion purely because designers made a bizarre collective aesthetic mistake. And somehow the entire decade went along with an objectively unflattering silhouette that everyone now looks back on with embarrassment and confusion. I know shoulder pads were a completely deliberate power statement engineered by women entering corporate America in significant numbers for the very first time. They literally designed their clothing to project physical authority and visual dominance in boardrooms built by and for men who had never shared professional space with women before. It was not a fashion accident. It was architectural dressing built specifically to command respect in hostile rooms. 57. Fast fashion exploitation of garment workers is a modern crisis born from recent decades of accelerating consumer demand and the specific economic pressures created by globalization and social media-driven trend cycles in the 21st century. Factory-produced cheap clothing and the systematic exploitation of garment workers dates directly to the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 killed 146 workers under conditions nearly identical to modern fast fashion factory scandals reported today. The industry has been having the exact same crisis with the exact same victims for over 200 years and calling it a new problem every single time. 58. A black tie dress code means every man in the room is required to wear a black tie as the literal centerpiece of their formal evening look because the name of the dress code describes exactly what must be worn. Black tie refers entirely to the formality level of an event and has never required a literal black tie as a mandatory accessory. The name describes a category of dressing that permits a wide range of tie and accessory colors within a formal silhouette. Men have been unnecessarily restricting their formal wardrobe choices based on a dress code name that was never meant to be taken as a literal instruction. 59. Yoga pants were designed specifically for yoga practice, and the athletic industry created them with the precise movements, flexibility requirements, and physical demands of yoga sessions firmly in mind as the primary design brief. So yoga pants were designed as general athletic wear and almost immediately became everyday casual clothing worn by millions of people who never set foot inside a yoga studio. The yoga industry publicly complained for years that the pants literally bearing their name had become completely disconnected from actual yoga practice. A garment named after a spiritual discipline became the official uniform of running errands and sitting in coffee shops. 60. So fashion is a shallow and frivolous industry that exists purely to sell unnecessary products to vain consumers and has never contributed anything meaningful to political movements, social progress, or the serious business of how human civilization actually develops and changes. Fashion is a $2.5 trillion global industry that has directly influenced wars, revolutions, and major civil rights movements throughout history. Our suffragettes use specific clothing color codes to organize and identify each other publicly. The Harlem Renaissance used fashion as a formal declaration of racial pride and cultural power. Clothing has always been political communication, and anyone who calls it shallow has simply never been paying attention. 60 myths, 60 lies, 60 things. History, schools, brands, and billion-dollar industries have been confidently feeding you your entire life. And the scary part is this list never ends. At Liebuster, we are just getting started destroying every fake fact the world built its reputation on. If something in this video genuinely shocked you, drop it in the comments right now because we want to know which lie you believe the hardest. Like this video? Share it with someone who still thinks Napoleon was short, and subscribe to Liebuster so the next myth we bust lands straight in your feed. And before you leave, the next video sitting on your screen right now contains lies just as wild as everything you just watched. Go find out what you believed that was never actually true.